For more, we are joined by Dr. Matthew Sussex, Associate Professor of Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University. Dr. Sussex, thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, talk to us about the significance of using this particular weapon, a new medium-range ballistic missile. Does this signal a potential nuclear escalation that the Biden administration initially feared?
Well, look, I think that the missile that the Russians have used is perhaps not as new as they're making out. Pretty much every ballistic missile is hypersonic, and this looks to be something called an RS-26. Which has a range of about 5,900 kilometers, which is just shy of the 6,000 kilometers, which is necessary to designate it as an intercontinental ballistic missile. And these are the types of missiles that Russia would use against Europe in the event of a nuclear war. So clearly, Moscow is signaling that it has these capabilities and it is able to use them, even though, of course, this missile was only conventionally armed. I think in terms of the way that the Biden administration reacts to this is probably to say, well, Moscow has made its point, but we're not going to change approach because, frankly, it's very unlikely that Putin would resort to, things like actually using real nuclear weapons. With only a couple of months to go before Biden is out and Trump is in the door. And clearly, Putin feels that he can get a much more sympathetic ear from President Trump 2.0 than he can from Biden. So I think the strategic risks of this are perhaps not as significant as they might seem on first blush.
So to a degree, Dr. Sussex, Putin is bluffing because I guess the message is that our missiles can reach further west of Ukraine into NATO member countries, but is unlikely to actually hit any NATO members because he wouldn't want to draw the risk of actually drawing the alliance directly into the war at this particular moment.
Yes, look, I think one thing that's been pretty constant in spite of the rhetoric coming out of the Putin regime has been a desire to very carefully avoid bringing NATO into the conflict, because if it were to do that, then, Putin would lose and would lose badly. His conventional forces are, barely able to make inroads in Ukraine after over 1,000 days. So I think, actually bringing NATO into the fight is not something that Putin wants to do. I think this is much more aimed at Western publics to make them fear the prospect of nuclear holocaust and to make them worry about the potential for escalation. When, in actual fact, the country that's done the invading and the escalating has been Moscow. And has been Russia. And, Ukraine has engaged in numerous attacks on Russian territory before this, and it hasn't had a response from Moscow.
So, Doctor, if Putin continues to test the boundaries of military escalation, how do you think this would change the calculus for Ukraine and its allies in terms of deterrence or even military planning?
Yeah, look, I think deterrence works fairly well if NATO remains united as a bloc. That, of course, doesn't take into account Ukraine itself, but it depends very much, I think, on what President Trump's attitude to the NATO alliance is, and whether he's prepared to continue to view NATO as a mutual security treaty where the US would be bound to help any European country that was attacked by outside aggression. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, what this use of this missile says is, well, in reality, it's more of the same, because the Russians have shot numerous different types of missiles which can have nuclear tips on them. The Iskander missile, the Kinjal missile have all been used against Ukraine for years now. So I don't think that really changes their calculus. If Russia was to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, then that's something that a shadow that Kiev has been living under ever since the invasion in February 2022.
Dr. Sussex, some analysts say both Russia and Ukraine right now are trying to maximize their battlefield and territorial gains given the uncertainty of a Trump presidency. So does that mean things are only going to get from bad to worse along the front lines right now for, I guess, forces there and also for Ukrainians between now and January 20th?
Look, I think that's a relatively fair assessment, that the pace of conflict is going to pick up. Winter is coming, of course, which is going to make it difficult for both sides. But both of them are trying to hold on to as many bargaining chips as possible. Ukraine, particularly in the Russian territory it seized in the Kursk region, and the Russians, of course, pressing their offensive in eastern Ukraine particularly, and wanting to make sure that it maintains, the ability to resupply Crimea. After that, when Trump comes to office, I think the big question that remains is, is there an incentive for Ukraine to come to the negotiating table? And is there an incentive for Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiating table? Some might argue that, Putin may decide that he can afford to continue on and put more pressure on the Trump administration to, in turn, pressure Kiev and pressure European countries to get the maximal type of peace, victor's peace that he wants.
Right. Dr. Sussex, I'm glad you brought that up because, I want to quote what the former foreign minister of Ukraine said, Dmytro Kuleba. He said he doesn't believe that Trump will abandon Ukraine. He told this to the BBC, and he says basically this is because Ukraine could become Donald Trump's Afghanistan. Do you see it in a similar way as well, I'm wondering?
Look, if there is a Russia-friendly peace in Ukraine, then it's only going to be really a frozen conflict, and there will be insurgencies on both sides, I think, for basically as long as we can conceive. In terms of where Trump comes out of this, if he does, abandon Ukraine and this turns into a political football, he does potentially face a reasonable amount of blowback, not just from, of course, Democrats. Not that he's too worried about what they think, but to some degree from moderate Republicans and even right-wing Republicans who've been strongly supportive of Ukraine. Now, of course, Trump can't run again as president, but certainly he will be very attuned to his legacy, and that may give him pause. He has, of course, however, people associated particularly with his administration, but also Trump, have said, that he can end it in 24 hours. His Vice President, J.D. Vance, has said, he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine. So I think there's some potentially mixed evidence that goes in different directions, and we're just going to have to wait and see until Trump gets into the White House.
All right, Dr. Sussex, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. Dr. Matthew Sussex, Associate Professor of Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University.